Iran has vowed revenge after an Israeli missile strike killed Iranian security chief Ali Larijani. U.S. President Donald Trump has called for backup to help force open the Strait of Hormuz, but so far allies have expressed no interest in getting involved. Meanwhile, a Pakistani-flagged tanker is reported to be the first non-Iranian ship to officially transit the Strait of Hormuz. And President Trump has announced a delay in his scheduled China visit. So lots of things happening at the same time. What do these latest developments signal about the situation in the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war against Iran? Will Iran open the strait to more countries? And what does Europe's refusal, at least for now, to assist the U.S. mean for transatlantic relations? Welcome to this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Da Nang, Vietnam by Wang Dan, China Director of the Eurasia Group, from Hong Kong SAR by Professor John Quelch, Executive Vice Chancellor of Duke Kunshan University, from Northeast Coastal City of China, Dalian, by political analyst Yang Xiyu, and here in the studio by Aina Tangen, Senior Fellow of the Center for International Governance Innovation. The warmest welcome to all of you. So let's start with the very latest, of course, the confirmation that Iranian security chief Ali Larijani has been confirmed killed alongside his son and several others, and by an Israeli airstrike. Now, he has been seen for a long time as a pragmatist, considered by the West to be someone whom they can talk to. Professor Yang Xiyu, let me start with you. How is this going to impact the war?
I think this latest, the so-called capitation, killed not only the person, but also killed the hopes of the peaceful and political settlement, simply because of the two reasons. And number one, internally, the Larijani is a bridge between the hardliners and the moderators inside Iran. And he was described by the Western media as a conservative moderate. And externally, he was highly experienced in negotiations with U.S., with the multilateral and bilateral with the U.S. So such person's loss is not only the great loss for Iran, but also the great loss for the peaceful probabilities. So I'm very sad not only for the person's loss, but also sad for the less opportunity for the peaceful solution in short term.
Aina, somehow this is very disturbing. I mean, this is of course not the first assassination attempts and operations against leaders of a country that's considered, a hostile or enemy by Israel, by the United States. What's particularly disturbing this time to you? Do you think Israel is going to achieve whatever they're going to achieve, or is it going to develop into a situation which goes out of control?
Well, there are two tracks here. There's the U.S. track. They share both fear and rage. Fear on the U.S. side that this could bring down the administration, that it would affect the midterm elections. In Israel, the fear is that the U.S. will withdraw, leaving them in this kind of forever war with Iran. So, and the rage on both sides, they believe that they can use a hammer instead of talks in order to settle this thing. And unfortunately, as we have seen throughout history, that is not how it works.
Let's turn to, I mean, this is definitely opening more, stirring up more hatred, I'm foreseeing. So At the same time, while the situation is escalating, at the same time, between the world's two largest economies, efforts are being made, at least on the Chinese side, to stabilize the situation, to provide certain level of certainty to the world. And one of the very latest development concerns President Trump's scheduled visit to China. Only earlier this week, certain media, and this was reported by China's official media, Xinhua, that a question was put forward to China's spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, asking him about certain Western media reports that Trump said his visit to China might be postponed if China doesn't provide assistance in escorting the Strait of Hormuz. And the spokesperson for China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, we noted that the United States has publicly made clarifications on the misguided media reports, calling them completely false, Lin Jian said, adding that the U.S. stressed that the visit is not linked to the issue over the Strait of Hormuz. I'm going to Professor John Quelch there. How do you understand the situation exactly? Has the trip been postponed according to your understanding, and how is that potentially affecting the situation on the ground?
My reading is that the meeting, very important meeting between the two presidents, has been postponed for 1 month at this point. I think what it indicates is that the war did not go as quickly as President Trump may have hoped. He may have hoped to have concluded the mission before the scheduled meeting at the end of this month.
Let's talk a little bit about another latest development concerning China-U.S. relations, which is the economic and trade talks the two sides had over the weekend in Paris. China said some consensus were reached, and I'm going to Wang Dan for this question. Now, during the talks, again, this is according to China's official information sources, during the talks, which are guided by important consensus reached by the two heads of state, the two sides reached some new consensus and agree to continue consultation. What is your reading of it? What does it mean exactly?
So the lack of detail from the Paris Agreement actually shows how significant this meeting is. And according to our foreign Prime Minister Wang Yi, that this is a big year for the China-U.S. relation. And both sides must have had extensive discussions over the Iran situation, the tariff situation, and the trade investment relationship in general. But if the summit between Trump and President Xi happen as scheduled, then the agenda will be overwhelmingly centering around the Iran situation, since that has the biggest immediate impact for both sides. And for the U.S., actually President Trump would need more from China than he could offer. He especially needs China to be on the same board when it comes to how to settle this war situation in Iran. He also wants China to unblock the Strait of Hormuz along with the U.S. And this is a very difficult situation given this quagmire that President Trump got himself into.
I know these very seemingly very separate developments are kind of standing alone in the conversation, but I want to turn to Aina and Professor Yang Xiyu for your understanding. How help us connect the dots here? The war in Iran, the meeting, whether postponed or not, between the presidents of China and the United States, and China's. What role can China play in terms of Strait of Hormuz? Aina, you first. How do you look at all of these that's happening at the same time?
Okay, I think you have to go back to the meeting in Busan. Obviously, Donald Trump did not get what he wanted, which was unrestricted access to rare earths. Even before that time, Donald Trump was obliquely attacking China, trying to cut off oil supplies. You saw what he did in Venezuela, also In Africa, he bombed a country, Nigeria, the largest oil producer in Africa, and then he's gone after Iran. There's a pattern there. So what you see is Donald Trump trying to control the situation, trying to push forward his hemispheric idea, but unfortunately he's miscalculated almost at every turn. And basically the Epstein files, what's happened with the economy in the US, and now this kind of ill-considered war, which he thought would go very, very well. So now he's in a situation where he's completely focused on Iran, how to get out. Israel is trying to figure out how they can keep the US in. China is trying to figure out how they can keep the world from going into a nuclear catastrophe if for instance, Israel felt that they could no longer defend themselves adequately against Iranian attacks, in which case they might consider using a nuclear weapon.
Mr. Yang, by saying that we noted that the United States has publicly made clarifications on misguided media reports, has China tacitly basically said the trip is being given second thoughts as far as the date is concerned?
Well, I think the postponement of the visit reflects the difficult situation facing President Trump, not facing China. However, the Iranian, U.S., Israel, Iran conflicts really input more difference between China and the U.S. in the whole relationship, in the whole summit, whole subjects of the top leaders' dialogue and negotiations. Simply because for China, our position can reflect by 2 points. Firstly, we definitely oppose U.S. and Israel's attacking Iran, simply because we oppose any action for solving some problems by force.
Yeah.
And secondly, we hope to end the conflicts as soon as possible. However, U.S. on one hand launched the military operation against Iran. And secondly, they want to make a bigger scale of the operation to end the war, totally different from China. So I think this difference will be one of the differences between the top leader topic. However, the trade issue, the bilateral relation remain on the top priority between the two top leaders.
Right. Maybe this is not the best moment to focus on that, because obviously President Trump needs to focus on the war in Iran. But speaking of China and the United States, another question a lot of people asked was whether the President Trump has called on China, among others, of course, to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz, and China did not acknowledge receiving such a request, nor did it say it denied such a request. Here's what China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson said on Monday. Now, he said the recent tense situation in the Strait of Hormuz and waters nearby has impacted the route for international goods and energy trade, disrupting peace and stability in the region and beyond. China once again calls on parties to immediately stop military operations, avoid further escalation of the tense situation, and prevent regional turmoil from further impacting the global economy. So here comes the big question, and everybody is asking, and I want to go to Professor Quelch, your understanding of the situation. How strongly is the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz affecting the global economy?
I think the potential for inflation and elevated interest rates is substantial. Obviously, there is around about 3.3 billion barrels of oil reserves in China. China has around 33%. The United States has a little bit less than that. And the International Energy Agency has around about a third as well. Collectively, at 100 million barrels per day of consumption, you can easily do the math, and knowing that a fifth of the world's consumption each day goes through the Straits of Hormuz, around about 160 days of reserves are available internationally at the moment. So once we get beyond 100 days of this conflict, there will be very, very serious effects. And that is why it's absolutely essential that the world works together to find an off-ramp for President Trump.
The world works together, okay. Can the world?
Stretched himself, but we have to find some off-ramp. Otherwise, there will be significant economic consequences.
I don't know whether the world can help Trump find an off-ramp. I mean, definitely, this is something that they started. They probably have to, figure that out. But Wang Dan, how is the situation affecting the world economy and especially China? Some people are saying, this is going to hit China pretty badly if the war goes on a bit too long.
Well, this current episode reminded me of the early COVID. When a global shock like this happens, actually the rest of the world has higher dependence on China's manufacturing than before, because they do need a more or less safety in delivery and cost control. So we haven't seen any real shock actually in terms of energy crisis or in terms of manufacturing production. And I do not believe that consumer prices in China would increase in the similar fashion as in the US and Europe. Because for one thing, the domestic fuel prices are regulated by NDRC quite heavily. Every 2 weeks, we adjust a domestic fuel price. And then for consumer basket, energy is about 9 to 10% of the total consumption. It's quite low comparing to the West. So although industrial costs will definitely go up, we don't see the kind of consumer inflation piling up. And for other parts of Asia, the situation is very different, especially for ASEAN countries. Many of the ASEAN economies were entering this monetary easing cycle last year in order to push up their domestic economy. But this year, facing the Iran crisis, those central governments and central banks had to delay or reverse the monetary stance. It's going to have a big disruptive impact on their economy.
Wang Dan, just to be clear, are you talking about, when you talk about China, are you talking about the short-term, near-term effects of the situation?
This is a short-term situation. In the medium term, actually, much of the price shock from the oil crisis will translate into a somewhat higher consumer price inflation in China as well. Because over time, China will have to step up its pricing scheme, just like other countries. Just in the short term, because of this abundance in China's oil reserve and gas reserve, there's a pretty good buffer. And last year, if we recall, there was the new energy law requiring that on the corporate level, they also have to have excessive reserve just in case of a crisis like this. So we on the paper have like 120 days of oil coverage, but in practice, it's actually way more than that.
Mr. Yang Xiu, what is your take? That seems to be the topic of a lot of press at this moment, and also, China has relatively better good relationship with Iran. Potentially, are China getting some kind of, potential passage through the straits?
Oh, well, as you mentioned, on one hand, let me put it by this way. On one hand, China, as a part of East Asia economies, also has been also affected negatively by the Hormuz crisis. But on the other hand, compared with the other East Asia economies, we, number one, have a better resilience than the others. And then number two, as you mentioned, we have a good relationship with Iran. And number three, we have been a front runner of the renewable energy to provide the electricity and other. So the negative effects on China is less than the others. And the other point is, I'm afraid the chain of the crisis, starting from the rising oil prices to rising prices of commodities, ranging from the semiconductor to chemical fertilizers and others, and to the overall inflation, plus the lower economic growth. If the inflation combined with lower economic growth, we will face the most serious challenge. We call it as a deflation. So that's the challenge facing not only China, but also facing all the world, including the United States.
Aina, how is your take on the immediate and near-term shock of these stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz?
Okay, in the short term, China does have the reserves. They can push those along. It's going to be, the real issue here is, let's step back. At $150 a barrel, the world goes into recession. At 200, we're looking at a depression. China will do relatively better. For one reason, they have the reserves in the short run. Second, in the midterm, China has mountains of coal. They don't want to use it, but that can be the transition. In the long term, China will complete its transition to renewables and also nuclear and perhaps fusion, which is already on the table for 2030. So yeah, China can do better, but the entire situation is not going to be any winners. People have said, oh, resource countries like Russia will do better or something like that. That's nonsense. There will be a lot of demand destruction. That means that people will stop producing. They won't use as much electricity and oil simply because they cannot afford it. And this will really, really hurt the entire world. So China's trying to figure out how it can they can't solve the U.S.'s problems, but there has to be some way to ease the pain that is coming.
Right. Well, there was also talk about, Iran asking oil tankers to pass through the strait, provided the oil cargo is traded in Chinese yuan. Aina, do you see that as something that's seriously going on? Do you think this is actually going to have a positive effect for the internationalization of renminbi?
Yeah, you've already seen it with the with the tanker that was going to Pakistan. There were rumors that another tanker that was carrying Chinese oil was able to get through. It's quite possible, but you have to remember, in that kind of situation, it's quite probable that either Israel or the United States will step in and say, if we can't have it, no one can. They could put boats out there, try to interdict them. We've already seen a pattern where they're seizing ships all over the world with impunity. So there's real dangers there. So I don't know that, I hope that would work, but Donald Trump is very much afraid of a diminution of the US dollar value, which would have a huge impact on the US given the debt and the situation. So I don't know that he would go along with it. He's increasingly going back and forth. One day he doesn't need anybody, the next day he's crying the victim because no one will help him. This is not a good time to be pressing him.
How much time, Professor Quelch, how much time does President Trump have in terms of seeing the war go on? Rising gas prices definitely is on the lips of everybody.
If you go back to 1973-74, October to January, the oil price quadrupled just in the space of 4 months. Now, during that shock period, the world did not have as large a reserve as a percentage of daily consumption as currently exists. So I think that it's not a matter of weeks, but it's certainly a matter of months, as I said before, maybe to put a number on it, between 3 and 4 months maximum since the outbreak of the conflict. It has to be solved during that time period.
Wang Dan, what is your take on the impact of the stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz on the U.S. economy?
The U.S. economy actually have full self-sufficiency in oil supply, but it still depends on the rest of the world for industrial goods and consumer goods. And the cost of all those things will go up, particularly the products made in China. And I don't think that the U.S. has a good preparation or anticipation on the scope of the crisis. So for President Trump, he wants the Federal Reserve to cut interest rate to boost the economy, while the inflation is steadily stepping up. So I can see only one solution to this actually is to normalize the trade relations with China. The two leaders might have 3 other chances to meet in the year, and there can be more extensive trade exchange and investment agreement from China to the US, and that could in fact mitigate at least the short-term impact of this oil shock.
Mr. Yang Xiyu, how do you see China could potentially play a bigger role here? Because it is obviously in China's interest that the war ends as soon as possible. China says it is keeping communication open with all sides. What can China do? What is China doing, to your knowledge?
I think China can make greater efforts in 2 fronts. On one hand, stabilize China's economy from disturbed by the crisis triggered by the conflicts, simply because China has been the greatest contributor to the global economic growth. The better China does, the better for the world economy, and vice versa. So first thing first is we need to make greater efforts to do better, not only for China, but also for the world as a whole. And secondly, we will be more effective and active in the peace efforts between the related parties. For example, we have provided humanitarian aid in that region,
right.
And also we have contact with all parties, including Israel. For example, Foreign Minister Wang Yi has had a phone call with Foreign Minister Israel counterpart, and also China and the U.S. has extensive dialogues in high levels, and we have a close contacts with many countries in Middle East. Simply saying, we hope and we need to end the war as soon as possible. All efforts made by China focus on ending the war as soon as possible.
Aina, 1 minute if you can. How do you see the situation going now that the conservative moderate Larijani has been assassinated? Do you think there will be more assassinations? Will the situation go worse before it gets better?
He was assassinated by the Israelis, who are intent, as I say, of keeping the U.S. in. Donald Trump is looking for an off-ramp, anyone he can grab. The issue is China has to be the adult in the room, and unfortunately, because there is no trust between Iran and the United States, and because Iran is intent on punishing the U.S. for doing all of these assassinations, they're doing it economically. Unfortunately, they're hurting everybody else in the process. So until a group, and I think this is middle power countries, come together and are willing to convene and then guarantee some sort of peace process that involves reparations to Iran and an understanding that Iran will be allowed to go out peacefully without more sanctions, I don't think this is going to end anytime soon.
What do you say European countries' position at this moment, that they have not been forthcoming to the U.S. demand?
They have not, and they do not intend to. They sit squarely in the middle. They're trying to be half pregnant once again. They don't want to be involved in the war, but they certainly were behind it when it started.
All right, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Wang Dan, John Quelch, Yang Xiyu, and Aina Tangen for your insight. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you live from Beijing. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.